Hi everyone, I'm Michael with Bad Goblin Games. This video is going to talk about movement in Ages of Conflict. So this is a second version of a movement video in regard to Ages of Conflict. We did a previous one a couple of months ago, though that one really just used software to show how we handle movement. This one we're going to use miniatures, dice, tape measures, basically give you more of a feel for what it looks like in a real game. We're also going to talk a bit more in depth as to some of the design decisions that we made in regard to movement. When we first started handling movement in Ages of Conflict, it was pretty standard. And by that I mean miniature war games, all for the most part, there's some changes or some deviations, but for the most part, most of them tend to follow the same path. And it's not just miniature war games. If you play role-playing games, then you see the same kind of design. And typically what that is you have a unit or a character or a figure, and they have a movement score, and that's how far they move during a turn. If they charge, they move double that. And then if they hit some terrain, let's say if they have to climb a fence or up a wall, run through a marsh, then their movement is cut in half. Or they are, or they express it as every inch equals, 2 inches, something along those lines. There's a pretty basic standard that almost seems universal. So that's where we started, because that's kind of like, what we're used to, what most people are used to. So that's where we started. Though then we wanted to build upon that. So we've made some changes to how that works. Still similar to that basic model, so I think you'll see some similarities, some things you'll recognize in there, though we want to take a bit more into account in regard to exactly how movement works. So let's start off with a couple of basics. Every unit in Ages of Conflict has a move attribute. Ages of Conflict is a metric-based system, so when you see a move score attached to a unit, that is its move in centimeters. So, for example, if we have infantry, which is probably the most common unit in the game, infantry rather, they all have a base move of 5 centimeters. Other units, such as cavalry, monsters like this giant, if you go into sci-fi, you have some armored walkers, and they'll have a different movement score. The base move is 5 centimeters for infantry, and then it kind of goes upon, it kind of just, other units just kind of build upon that. In conjunction with that base move attribute, we have move paces. So we're going to talk about that, and we're going to show you some examples, and we're going to show you how those movement paces integrate with the three, I guess there are three factors that really go into exactly how far your unit moves each turn. That is the order your unit is given, the ground that your unit is moving over, as well as the formation. Ages of Conflict does have formations in it, and some of these formations do restrict how far you can move, or they may give you certain benefits in regard to your movement. So let's talk about all that now. The first thing I want to talk about is establishing just the baseline of how movement works. As I stated, every unit in Ages of Conflict has a move attribute associated with it. For our example here, we're just going to use a standard infantry unit. Infantry units have a move attribute of 5, so that's 5 centimeters. The move attribute works in conjunction with what we refer to as movement paces. The movement pace is the specific distance your unit moves, and that pace is based upon your unit's move attribute. So there are 3 paces available. There's ordinary, quick, and charge. And we're just going to talk about, first off, I'm just going to show you how far each of those paces are, and then we'll go into some examples of of how that movement pace works with in regard to, say, the orders, the ground, and the formation that your unit's in. So first off is the ordinary pace. And this is the slowest pace available to your unit. A unit's ordinary pace is equal to its move attribute. So if this unit has a move of 5, if it's moving at an ordinary pace, it is permitted to move 5 centimeters. Quick pace is double the move attribute. So this unit, if its move attribute is 5, moving at a quick pace, it can move 10 centimeters. The last pace is the charge pace. This is the quickest pace, or the fastest pace available to a unit. This is 3 times the unit's move attribute. So for our example here, this unit could move 15 centimeters since its base move is 5. Now, the specific pace you would take is determined by the order, by the ground, as well as the formation that the unit's in. Now that you have an understanding of how we handle the movement attribute along with the movement paces, we're going to go through the 3 situations that really determine the movement pace that you can take during the game. That's the order the unit's given. So Ages of Conflict is an orders-based system. If you haven't watched the intro video, we do kind of talk about orders briefly there, though we'll have another video coming out in which we go into much more detail regarding the orders along with the turn sequence. Though for now, just understand that there are orders that affect how far you can move, and we'll talk about a couple of those orders in a moment. The ground that your unit moves over, whether it's ground that impedes your movement or does not impede your movement, as well as the formation your unit's in. All 3 of those affect the specific movement pace your unit is allowed to take. So we'll talk about that now, starting with orders. Let's go over how orders affect movement. There are 3 orders that affect movement in Ages of Conflict. We have several orders available. We're just going to go over the ones that are really pertinent to movement. And we're not going to go over these real in depth. We have another video coming up that covers the orders as well as the turn sequence in much more detail. We're just going to kind of touch on them briefly here so you can get an understanding of how the order that you give your unit affects how far it can move. And I'm just going to slide these out of the way. We'll just kind of deal with one base here. So the first order we'll talk about is the march order. This is, I would say, probably the most common order that you'll see in the game. The march order allows your unit to do a couple of things. The first is, we'll talk about since it's the most important, since we're talking about movement. It allows your unit to move, assuming it's on smooth ground, to move up to its quick pace, which is double the move, so 10 centimeters. A march order also allows your unit to move and engage in hand combat, or it can move and later in the turn cast missiles. Again, we'll talk about that stuff in a different video, a bit more detail. For our purposes here, just understand that the march order allows a unit on smooth ground to move up to its quick pace of double its move attribute. So in this case, for this infantry, 10 centimeters. The second order that permits movement is the charge order. So the charge order is the order that you would typically give if you want your unit to just simply cover as much ground as possible, and is an order that you would give your unit if you want to engage in hand combat as more of a shock tactic. So let's talk about those a bit now. So the charge order allows your unit to move at a charge pace. So over smooth ground, this unit can move up to 3 times its move attribute. Since its move attribute is 5, at a charge order, it can move 15 centimeters. Units can only move at a charge pace over smooth ground. They cannot move at a charge pace over rough ground. We'll talk about rough ground a bit in a few minutes. Though for right now, just understand that units that have a charge order and moving at a charge pace can only move that charge pace over nice, smooth ground. So there are a couple, well, within combat, there's a reason you would use a charge pace. And let's kind of go through a couple of examples here just so you can kind of see. We're touching a bit on combat here, though it's okay because it's really part of movement as well. So we have two units here. We have a unit of infantry and we have a unit of cavalry. Every unit within Ages of Conflict has a presence attribute. The presence attribute is a combination of a unit's, basically it's the aura that the unit projects on the field. Okay, so and the presence attribute is determined by the type of unit. So here, the infantry, every base or every company has a presence of 1 for infantry. Every base or company of cavalry has a presence of 2. Move that out of the way because I'll knock it down again. And other units have different presence types. So, for example, monsters like this giant, they might have a 3, a 4, or a 5, just depending upon the size of the monster. So the presence attribute is determined by the type of I guess what the company or what the unit rather is composed of. So that's important for this reason. Units with a higher presence may cause units with a lower presence to flee from the field if they engage that enemy with charge orders in hand combat. So for our example here, this unit of cavalry declares that they are going to move into hand combat with this unit of infantry using charge orders. Okay. So the first thing that happens as soon as this player says, okay, I am charging this infantry, because the presence of this unit is smaller than this unit, and let's calculate that real quick because I didn't really do that. When you calculate presence, you add up all the companies within the unit. So there's 3 companies here. Each has a presence of 1. That means this unit's total presence is 3. The cavalry, each is 2. There are 3 in this unit, so their total presence is 6. So the cavalry has a presence of 6. The infantry has a presence of 3. The cavalry charges the infantry. Since the cavalry has a higher presence, this infantry may simply flee the field in face of that charge. In order to not do that, this unit is obligated to make a command check. A command check is typically 2 dice, 2d10. Your goal here is to roll a 6 or more on one of these dice. You don't need both, you just need one. So the infantry declares their charge, the cavalry declares their charge, the infantry must then make their command check. In this case, I rolled a 3 and an 8. That is a success because one of the rolls was a 6 or more. So the infantry stands firm in the place of the charge. If they fail, if they had instead rolled a 3 and a 4, that's a failure. The infantry would then rout from the field. So we do this to simulate that commanders weren't necessarily trying to, they didn't really want to simply just kill or slaughter. I mean, it did happen, obviously. Though the typical or the first goal was to simply get your opponent to leave the field, either by just giving up before the fight started or during the fight just through intimidation, which is what we reflect with this charge. So the cavalry here, their real goal isn't necessarily to engage the infantry. Their real goal is to get them just to leave. So that's reflected in this rule. Now there is a downside to moving at that charge pace. So let's say our infantry, let's say they were giving a charge order, they move at a charge pace. So again, for them, that's 15 centimeters. Now, in our example here, they did not come into contact with an enemy. So basically, this unit was simply more or less, I wouldn't say necessarily sprinting across the field, but they were running. I mean, they were going at a nice head of steam here. So the important fact to remember here is that this is hundreds of soldiers, okay, and this is a close formation unit. So this is hundreds of soldiers, all in ranks and columns. This is a close formation unit. So when these soldiers are running across the field, the further along they go, the more disorganized this unit is going to get. Because you can't really maintain that close formation for a long period of time when you're charging. These are soldiers who are running at, there's some are faster than others. There's adrenaline. There's some fear. So there might be some that are kind of holding back a bit. They're carrying weapons, armor, several factors that go into it. But the point is that from the time they leave point A to the time they get to point B, they're not really going to be as organized as they were when they left. So to reflect that, any unit that moves at a charge pace and does not come into contact with an enemy is obligated to make a command check. It's the same command check we just rolled, so it's 2d10. You want one of these to be a 6 or more. I rolled a 3 and a 7. That is a success. So this unit went from A to B, and they did not lose cohesion. That doesn't necessarily mean they were perfectly organized, but as far as game purposes, they're close enough where it only took them a few seconds or a few minutes to kind of get organized again. Now let's say they failed. Let's say they rolled a 3 and a 5. So that's a failure because I needed at least one of those to roll a 6. In that case, the unit becomes disorganized. And disorganized is simply a condition that shows that the unit has lost cohesion. The unit can try to regain that cohesion then during their next turn. Though for this turn, for the remainder, well, I guess I should say until they remove this disorganized condition, they are at some penalties in hand combat and range combat. So it's not a situation you want to be in while engaged in hand combat. The last order we'll talk about that affects movement is, and actually there's several, this is just kind of an example. So change formation. Change formation is an order that you would want to give a unit if you want to move from, say, a line formation. Let's say you want them to adopt a shield wall or a column or a square or any other formation. To do that, the unit is given a change formation order. Any unit that's given change formation orders is not permitted to move during that turn. So this is an example of how orders can negatively affect how far a unit can move. So the march order and the charge order, they say, yes, you can move, 10 or 15 or whatever the pace may be. In this case, because of the order you gave the unit is simply not permitted to move. They spend the entire turn trying to change their formation. And there's some other orders that carry similar move penalties. We talk about those more in the upcoming video that deals with the orders and the turn sequence. So that's how orders affect how far your unit can move. Now we're going to talk about how ground affects how far your unit can move. This is an important consideration for miniature war games, really because if you've played miniature war games before, then you've lost games, or your opponent's lost games simply because a unit wasn't where it needed to be when it needed to be there, and oftentimes that's just caused by terrain or by ground. If you put your unit in a bad position, or it's forced to deal with some hindering terrain or hindering ground, it's going to slow it down. And when you need that unit to be there, either to draw off an attack or to counterattack, hit an enemy in the flank, whatever, it's not going to be there, and that can cost you a game. So let's talk about the ground, and we'll kind of talk about some examples of what we consider to be rough ground, as well as what we consider to be smooth ground, and how all that affects how far you can move in Ages of Conflict. So anyone who's been outside, and maybe you've ran or walked maybe on a track or a nice smooth sidewalk, versus say trying to move through woods, even light brush, not talking necessarily thick woods where you can't see more than a foot or two beyond you, but even light brush, or just moving through like a muddy field. I mean, you understand how difficult it is moving from one type of ground to another. Now, put yourself in the position of it's not just you, though you are now marching side by side with a couple hundred fellow soldiers, and you're shoulder to shoulder, nearly shoulder to shoulder, and you're trying to keep this nice tight formation. So that's how ground affects movement. And in Ages of Conflict, we have two different movement types, or not two different movement types. We have two different types of ground, I should say, and they affect the movement. So the first type is smooth ground, like this. So this battle mat represents just a nice, smooth, easy, grass field. So for our purposes, smooth ground is anything that you consider does not impede movement. So that can be this grass field, it can be a plowed field, it can be a road, anything that you say, these guys can move across in this formation and it's not really going to affect them. So units moving through or on smooth ground can move at they have a few different options available to them. If you give them the march order that we talked about earlier, then they can go up to their quick pace. So again, for our infantry here, that's 10 centimeters. They can also take advantage of the charge order, again, which for this unit, since their move attribute is 5 and the charge pace is 3 times the move attribute, that means they can go 15 centimeters. So if your unit is on smooth ground, they can move it at the quick pace, no problem. They can move it at charge pace, no problem. The challenge comes when you are moving over what we call rough ground. So rough ground is anything that impedes movement. So there's a few different examples of that. It can be trees. It can be moving, say, up a hill. It can be moving, say, through a field that we're saying is unplowed, rough, rocky. It can be moving over, fences, hedgerows, anything that's going to cause these guys to slow down a bit, right? So let's walk through a couple of examples. We'll use this unplowed field just because it's pretty easy to use. The basic rule with rough ground and movement is that anytime your unit is moving through rough ground or into rough ground, that unit is restricted to a maximum move equal to its ordinary pace. So for our infantry here, since their move is 5 and an ordinary pace is equal to your move attribute, that means their ordinary pace is 5 centimeters. So if they begin their turn in rough ground, the most they can move is 5 centimeters. If the unit is, let's say they begin their turn outside of rough ground, let's just say they are 3 centimeters away from this ground. They move 3 centimeters, they hit the rough ground. At that point, their move is immediately reduced to a maximum of their ordinary pace. It doesn't matter what they were moving before. Once they hit that rough ground, their move is immediately reduced to a maximum of their ordinary pace. So if they go 3 centimeters, encounter this rough ground, now they can only move 2 more centimeters. So that's a total of 5. If they start 4 centimeters away, hit this rough ground, they can only move 1 more centimeter, because that's a total of 5. Now let's say this unit was, let's say they're on march orders, so they can move up to 10 centimeters, because right now they're on smooth ground. Okay, they're starting their turn on smooth ground, so they can move up to 10 centimeters. They move 8 centimeters, encounter this encounter this rough ground, at which point their move is immediately reduced to a maximum of their ordinary pace. Since they have already moved more than their ordinary pace, their movement for this turn comes to an immediate end. So that is how rough ground affects your movement. So just the basic rule is, if you are in rough ground to start your move, or if you encounter that rough ground as part of your move, then your move for this turn, or for that turn, is restricted to a maximum of your ordinary pace. The last consideration we have that determines specifically how far a unit can move is the formation the unit is in. Ages of Conflict has multiple formations available that allow your units to deal with specific situations, such as skirmishing, if you just need to be able to move pretty fast. We do have, say, defensive formations like the Testudo available if you're dealing with a hail of incoming missile weapons, arrows, slingshot, that sort of thing. And those formations affect your movement in different ways. So let's go over the formations we have available. We're not really going to go into how those formations are used within combat. We have a combat video coming out, so we'll talk about that then. In this video, we're really just going to deal with how those formations affect how far your unit can move. The last consideration we have for affecting movement is the formation that your unit is in. So the basic formation in Ages of Conflict is just like a line formation. This is what you're going to see probably most typical when you're dealing with historical and fantasy and black powder. When you go to, say, World War II and sci-fi, that changes a bit, though for the historical and fantasy and black powder genres, the standard default formation is the line formation. Now, we offer different formations simply because we want to give units, or say units they adopt these formations to deal with different types of, say, threats or just situations on the battlefield. So we'll talk about each of these formations and maybe some circumstances in which you would use each one. Some of the pros and cons that come with them. We're not really going to talk too much about how they handle combat, because the formations do affect what the units can do in combat. But since we're talking about movement in this video, we're really just going to talk about how they handle movement. So the standard line formation doesn't really affect your movement. It has some combat stuff, such as you can just bring more firepower to bear on the enemy because you're more spread out. It means all these companies can target the enemy, say with missile weapons, bows or slings or muskets. Though the line formation itself doesn't affect movement, unless again you're going at that charge pace and you don't encounter enemy, then you'll have to roll to see if you become disorganized. though the pace itself doesn't restrict any movement. We have a couple of, say a few defensive formations. The first we'll talk about is a shield wall. So here we'll talk about real quick, I want to just kind of make note that when you're dealing with miniatures, it can be a little challenging to know, there's no way to really tell if this unit is in a line formation, just a standard line formation, or if they've adopted something defensive like a shield wall or testudo. So we do have these tokens available. So if this unit does go into a shield wall formation, then I can just put down this little shield wall token, and that way the unit knows that, or that way I know, my opponent knows that they're in a shield wall. So it's not a surprise for them, and so I don't forget. So a shield wall, it's a defensive formation, and basically it gives the unit some bonuses in dealing, like on basically some defensive bonuses. Though for movement purposes, this is not really a formation that you're going to adopt with the intent of trying to charge into the enemy. Now you still might move in to engage, but you're not getting that real head of steam up. So with this formation, you are restricted to your ordinary pace. So for this unit, they would be restricted to 5 centimeters while they're in a shield wall. So this isn't really a formation that you would adopt when you're a good distance away from the enemy, because that would take you a long time to trudge across the field. It's typically the formation that you may want to adopt if you are if you're trying to hold a position, or if you're anticipating an enemy charging into you. Next up is the testudo formation. So this is similar to a shield wall, with the added benefit that the soldier is not just creating this wall in front of them with shields. Now they're also going overhead, to the sides, to the rear. Basically, the entire unit is encompassed in their shield. So this is a purely defensive formation. So you're going to get, and when I say defensive, it's really defensive against, it's intended to be defensive against missile weapons. So again, as with the shield wall, if you're in a testudo, you are limited to your ordinary pace, 5 centimeters. And just to be clear, when I say limited to your ordinary pace, that means you cannot move at a quick pace, you cannot move at a charge pace. So you cannot adopt a testudo or a shield wall, give that unit a charge order, and have them go charging across the field. If this unit is in, say, a shield wall and you want them to charge, they must first be given a change formation order. And if they're given a change formation order, they cannot move that turn. They can only attempt to change that formation. So if I want them to go from a shield wall to a line formation and charge, they must first be given a change formation to go from a shield wall to a line, and then on the next turn they can be given a charge order, and they can charge across the field. We'll just kind of stay with some of the, with the defensive formations. We have a square formation, and again we give a token because a square can be a little challenging to denote. This one only has 3 bases, so I might do something like this. If I have 4 bases, I might do something like this. You kind of have to play around with this a little bit. So a square is a defensive formation. As with the testudo and the shield wall, this is not a formation that you're really going to be moving with. It's intended that the unit's going to adopt this formation because they are anticipating something bad coming to them, and so they're going to adopt this formation and then more or less sit tight and allow that enemy to come to them. That doesn't mean they can't move, but they are just restricted to an ordinary pace if you're in that square formation. Next up is a phalanx formation. So this is like the classical formation that you would see the Greeks utilized, but it goes as far back as Mesopotamia, or at least as far back as Mesopotamia. So this is really a formation in which these soldiers were really tightly knit close together, shields in front of them, and spears or long pole arms out in front of them. Such as like if you're dealing with an Alexandrian army, then you might see them with sarissas. Basically some kind of 15 to 20 foot long, pole arm. So they basically look like hedgehogs. So this is really a challenging formation to deal with from an offensive perspective. However, it is limited by movement, and you're going to have not only are you limited to your ordinary pace, though you are also dealing with some issues moving through rough ground. So again, historically, this is not a formation that dealt well with rough ground, and this is a formation that the Romans used and then had to abandon simply because they had issues maneuvering in the formation. The last formation we have available is a skirmishing formation, and it has a token. Just because you can't really tell. So the skirmishing formation is a little bit different than the others. So the others were really more or less defensive, except for the phalanx. The skirmishing formation, its intent is to allow units to engage the enemy with missile weapons, but also have the ability to stay away from the enemy. So let's say if they were in a skirmishing formation, they want the ability to get as close to the enemy as they can to unleash their slings or arrows or spears or javelins or whatever, but then they also want the ability to quickly evade, to quickly get away. So that's what the skirmishing formation does. Unlike the other formations in which the soldiers are moving tightly, in a tight formation, skirmishing is a loose formation, so they're not moving shoulder to shoulder. They're much more spread out. So they'll get some defensive bonuses with this if they have missile weapons. If they're targeted by missile weapons, they're at some pretty severe penalties if they get engaged in hand combat. For movement, however, the important thing to remember here is that units in a skirmishing formation can move over rough ground at a higher pace than the ordinary. They can also move at a charge pace without becoming disorganized. So if this is a skirmishing formation and I move at my charge pace of 15 centimeters and I do not engage an enemy, I do not test to become disorganized. So that's one of the primary benefits of skirmishing. It's not a formation that you want to use to engage in hand combat. It's a formation that you want to use to harass the enemy, but also you want to be able to quickly get away from the enemy in case they decide to turn in your direction and come at you. Well, that'll wrap up our video for movement in Ages of Conflict. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope we kind of give you a better idea of how we handle movement within the game. If you enjoyed this video and want to see other aspects of how Ages of Conflict work, we will have other videos coming out, hopefully about one a week. So be sure to check back in, subscribe to the channel so you can get notified. Leave some comments below, and we'll be happy to answer any questions you have, any kind of comments. You can find us on Facebook. Just look for Ages of Conflict. We'll have a link at the end of this video, so join us there. Same thing, we'll be happy to answer any kind of questions, any kind of comments or suggestions you have. We also make beta copies of the rules freely available. Just pop in and either ask for a copy, or so often I just kind of tell everyone there's a new version available within the files section of the Facebook group, so you can just kind of pop in and grab it there. Anyway, appreciate you watching, and join us again next time. Thank you.